Hey everyone, welcome. Quiero dar la bienvenida a todos mis radio oyentes. I'm Kris Torres, and this is KRIS'S COURT, the podcast where we talk about legal terms, law in Puerto Rico, and what I think about it all. Let's go. Bueno, today is the 25th of July, o sea, Día de la Constitución. And for some Puerto Ricans, it's the day that we commemorate our autonomy or the ability to self-rule. However, for others, it's really more Día de la Colonización. In other words, it reminds us that we are still subjugated and oppressed, trying to find our way to gain self-autonomy. Which one is it? Well, perhaps that's a topic for another time, but I leave it to you to investigate and figure out for yourself, maybe come to some conclusions before we discuss it here. But like I said, it's the 25th of July, and it's the official day that I'm launching this podcast. And before I start, and it's going to be quite a long podcast just because it's the first one, but before I start, I want to say a little bit about my background. Now, of course, it's a long story, but here's the synopsis.
Let's take it from the top.
Well, my parents are from two different worlds. My mom came into Puerto Rico. She married my father, came to Puerto Rico basically as an immigrant and settled herself here with my dad, who's originally from El Sur de Puerto Rico. Now, we grew up in the West, El Oeste de Puerto Rico, and that's pretty much most of my understanding and my upbringing. Mi crianza fue en Puerto Rico, en el Oeste de Puerto Rico. Now, I grew up kind of, in a middle-class family, hardworking, dedicated, always pursuing a good education, understanding, helping your fellow man, and all of those things. And throughout my upbringing, I would say that I gained a lot of strong qualities from both of my parents and understanding the conflict between those two worlds, the world of the United States and the world of Puerto Rico. Now, some words maybe I would use to describe me are intense, motivated for sure, critical, not in the negative sense, but more of a critical eye, very reflective, very, I like to pursue thinking and knowledge to be able to see how I can understand myself, the world, and help others do the same. And I'm God-fearing. I go to church regularly. And I think these really describe me well. I mean, all of them combined have kind of motivated me to do this podcast. And honestly, when I have an idea, I really go for it. Once it's in my head and I think it's a really good idea, I go for it. So that's what I'm doing here. Well, what I've been up to up until this point, my profession is education. I've been in the education sector for a while, and I love studying. I love learning, and I could always do more. And basically, that's what I'm doing now. I've actually changed my whole view or kind of my career path. And instead of going full into education, now I'm switching gears a little bit. Y ahora me estoy metiendo en derecho. So I'm going into law. So current plans right now es que yo voy a ir a la escuela de derecho en la UPI, el recinto de Río Piedra. And so that's what I'm doing right now. I'm going to law school. And I'm about to start very soon. Super excited. Well, why this podcast? Of course, like I said, changing careers, going to law school. And I think as someone who's very critical, someone who's very motivated and intense, I think the best way to strengthen my own understanding and to better help myself and serve other people is to have a way to process what I'm learning. right? Y la manera que voy a hacer eso, o lo que pienso que lo puedo hacerlo hasta mejor, right, is to do this podcast where I put down my ideas, my thoughts, and kind of have a critical eye of law and what I'm learning as a law student. Now, that, is basically in a nutshell why this podcast came about or how it came about. I mean, at the same time, like I said, I was in the education sector, and my students wanted to, they encouraged me to, try to keep up with them, to maintain that relationship. And I just love that we could have that relationship, that I can have that relationship with my students, right? Shout out to all of them out there who are listening right now. And so they encouraged me to do that. And one of the ways that I thought maybe I could do that is to do a podcast where I open conversations about this. And they can also, as high schoolers and even as university students, they can learn too about, what it is to be a citizen, what it means to be someone in society who can learn more about the law and know how to process the law. And so, yeah, that's part of the reason why I'm doing this. That begs a question. ¿El podcast va a ser en inglés o en español? Is it going to be in English or in Spanish? Well, I really think that it depends on the topic and the day. I think in general, I'm probably going to use English because it's more widely spoken, and I want to still allow those who aren't in the United States, maybe even have a Latina background, but that they don't know Spanish as fluently, that they can also chime in, they can participate. And pero a veces voy a hablar en español porque, bueno, el tema lo merece, right? So some topics are going to be very dependent on that Spanish language, especially with those legal terms. So it really depends on the day, but I think in general, it'll appeal to everybody, and everybody will be able to contribute, be a part of, and enjoy this podcast. So that's a little bit about the background of of me, the founder, and the podcast. Let's switch over to today's topic. Today's topic is going to be a particular section del Código Civil de Puerto Rico, la edición 2020. So it's the 2020 edition of the Civil Code of Puerto Rico, the newest one. It hadn't been updated in decades prior to this point. And it's going to connect with some of the things that I experienced during the orientation, one of the first orientations of law school, de la UP. So I'm going to read the section that stood out to me, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. So, según el capítulo 4, interpretación y aplicación de la ley, el artículo 25 dice así: tiempo, género y número de las palabras. Right? And there's a little bit of section of more specific, what or rule that relates to. And it says like this: las palabras usadas en este código en el tiempo presente incluyen también el futuro. Okay, and here's this part I want to highlight. It's in bold. I want to stress this part in particular. Lo que tiene que ver con el género, what's dealing with gender. Las usadas en masculino incluyen el femenino, a menos que por la naturaleza de la disposición se limiten manifestamente a uno solo. Y después dice, it also says, el número singular incluye el plural y el plural incluye el singular. Right? Now, I want to focus on the idea of the gender or género in this section. First off, I was kind of surprised, and in a good way, how they mention, they focus in the very first part, right? This is Libro Uno. This is the very first book of the Civil Code. they stress the importance of indicating it, delineating and talking about these specific areas related to the structure, related to grammar, so that it queda claro, right? So it's clear to those who read it and those who maybe listen to it, so that they can know, okay, this is how we're going to treat these grammatical structures, or right, the language within. And me and my background with languages and studying quite a bit of languages, right? Um, I definitely wanted to hit on this first, this linguistic aspect of this, beginning of the civil code. And I wanted to connect. I wanted to. I want to connect it to something that I heard during the orientation in one of the presenters, right? Specifically, while we were being introduced to the program and talking about scholarships, the platform that we'll be using, the virtual platform, and all of that, one of the presenters used the terms algunes and nosotros en vez de, or instead of algunos y nosotros, right? And I'm seeing this trend happen quite frequently. I mean, it has been a thing for a while in English, right? With the kind of general terms. But I noticed that it's also being a part of Spanish. I mean, we've heard Latinx, Latine, and certain other ones, right? And I understand the sentiment. I understand the idea behind it. Basically, these terms are to include inclusividad, right? So inclusivity, y por extensión, igualdad, right? We want inclusivity to reflect also the equality that we have amongst one another, amongst members of society, right? And at the same time, Spanish in particular finds a weak spot potentially in the language, in that no tiene términos neutros, right? It doesn't have neuter, as opposed to English and some other languages, right? So neuter is a good grammatical, it has a good grammatical use, in that it can provide, since it's neuter, it could be neutral at the same time, right? It doesn't specify a gender. And sometimes when you're with a big group of people, or you're trying to indicate it usually is when you're dealing with more than one person or two people, you want to include everybody, right? And so in order to do that, neuter is very useful for that in terms of language. And in English, like I said, it's happening. And we have the use of the tercer persona, the they, right? And we use it as a general they to refer to individuals, right? Con ese término no se identifica en sí su género, right? Because when you say they, it doesn't show what gender it is, right? And at the same time, sometimes I do this. I use they to kind of indicate a single person, right? Pero en español tú no tienes eso. Tú no puedes decir ella o él. I mean, you don't have the él o ella, right? So this, or I guess it would be more ellos, but you would see it still has the o, or ellas still has the a. So you have that problem that you're still indicating what the gender is. Now, in in English, right? Or better said, in Spanish, when you want to use a general term, you usually use a masculine form, right? That's the idea. That we call it the masculine form, right? But it causes problems with our female counterparts, right? Because they become embedded in that, and for the sake of the term, it doesn't reflect their identity, or it doesn't reflect their participation in that group, right? So it could cause issue. I would say because of that, um, they in Spanish we see like some type of new suffix, un nuevo sufijo plural en español, right? So that it starts with an e, right? And I think it is a criticism of the Spanish grammar, right? Y su uso de género, and its use of gender, because it doesn't, it allows Spanish now to distinguish between entities, objects, persons, and at the same time, it it does it does bring similar problems, though, as the general they, or the neuter they, that is used in English. Okay. Now, like I said, studying linguistics, I, for many years, and that's a lot of my academic background, I've learned a lot about this, right? The use of gender within grammars. And what I've understood is that a lot of the languages, they usually have two classes, like at a base, two classes, or that reflect usually gender, the masculine and the feminine, right? However, there are some that have a third, right, which would be the neuter. Okay, and the thing is, since many of these languages, at least, have two classes of distinction, you have to fit all your words within those classes, right? And these languages distinguish them differently. It's not always consistent. For example, en español, right, el sol es masculino. Sun is masculine in Spanish. Mientras que la luna es femenina. The moon, feminine. However, en alemán, el sol, la palabra sol en alemán es femenino y la luna masculina. In other words, in German, the words are switched, like their genders are switched. Sun now is feminine and moon is masculine, right? And that happens with other, languages as well, that not only do you switch, right, the genders between different languages for certain objects or entities, or and so on, right? But you also find that in other languages, you don't just have two classes or even three, including the neuter, but you have several classes that are based on, certain categories that they feel are important to that language, right? Or important to maybe their culture, important to their background, whatever it is, that how they're living, right? Their life, their lifestyle. So, for example, in this language, indigenous language of North America, the Yurok, they actually have a class that is focused on, or it's solely for objects that are wavy, that are curvy, right? Esos objetos que se distinguen por su curva, right? So some of these that have that kind of structure in the, in reality, are like ropes and your shoelaces, and snakes, worms, and a whole number of other type of maybe string like objects. You have these fit within that particular class, right? So what does that say then for us, right, in terms of language, and in terms of, the use of these neuter type of, more with the intention of inclusivity and equality? Well, if we look at these classes, right, just on their own, and as grammar, as um, components, or features of grammar, right, and we kind of look at them separately from the uh, gender, then we can say that it's really looking at them like if it's class A or class B. And of course, I'm not saying that class A is superior or class B is inferior or less superior, but you just have differences within the classes, right? Or the structural classes. And that's part of reality, that we have distinctions. And that's some of the things that you know, we find pride in. We really that make us who we are is our distinctions, not to the harm or the detriment of somebody else, but to elevate ourselves. We define ourselves a lot of times by our distinctions, but at the same time with what makes us similar to others, to our neighbors. Now, I would say that maybe some more progressive people would say that that the use of gender to distinguish class is it excludes certain people, right? Because of course, I mean, I would say that if we have class A and class B and even class C, or we have and in Spanish in this case we really mostly have with few exceptions or some exceptions, we have masculine and feminine, and I would say that that reflects reality in most cases, right? And so it would say that it excludes certain people from the conversation, maybe people who and it limits their self representation, right? Because some of these people don't fall in either of those categories, or they identify themselves with another category, right? So where you have masculine and feminine, some people they say they're non-binary and so on, and so it feels like it's limiting. But I'm not really sure that changing the language and the way that it is presented en realidad, right? Doing that, it really is that going to bring the changes that these people are wanting, right? Because at the same time, changing the language, and if it's not natural, right, it's forced, because usually language does change, it's fluid. But when it's forced, it creates problems oftentimes, right? And for example, we have algunes y nosotros, like I mentioned in the that I heard in the orientation, right? These intend to promote inclusivity, but how do we address words like modelo in Spanish, which it seems to be masculine, but it could also be feminine? La modelo, right? And we also have words like líder, which doesn't necessarily, you can't really add the e at the end to show it's different, right? Lídere, is that what you're going to do? And then do you have to change the article? Instead of el and la, you say le, but then you get into the problem of le being like to him, to her, to it, right? Like le gusta, which would be he or she or it likes something, le gusta. So it creates a problem where it's like, is this the article? Is it not the article? And it could create confusion. And even words like bebe, which in general, we already have the e, but it reflects both already. La bebe, el bebe, or even persona. Persona is consistently used, right? Like gente, but it's la gente, la persona, and these are feminine words, and they're used for men as well as women, right? And even those who identify themselves in a different way. But are we expected to change those as well when they are inclusive and they have been around for many, 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 many years, and that no one gets upset at these words? Why? Because we understand that they're inclusive. So I think part of the problem is that we have to also change our mindset in how we see these. Instead of seeing them as indications of lack of inclusivity, indications of lack of equality, we should see whether we can promote a positive view that shows that they're inclusive without having to change the whole grammar and potentially creating a whole host of other problems that were not foreseeable. At least that's my, you know, my view. Now, you can choose to label me as someone who seems insensitive, maybe as lacking understanding in this area, but in reality, I think that language, this is what I believe, is that language can and should improve, but always when and if necessary. Who determines when it's necessary? Not sure. Potentially the users, but we also have learners that can also influence, right? Because it's hard to say, right? Who makes changes in a nation? Are the people who are part of the nation, or is it the people who also come in, who are not necessarily integrated into the nation, that can also have a say? But whether or not, regardless of that, I do think that it should improve, but we have to see how it improves, right? And it should be natural. It shouldn't be forced. And in many cases, it having an agenda could create, in a negative sense, could create other problems that also cause issue with maybe other minorities, right? That we're not taking into account. Now, I also think, I think that if we do something, if we're going to do something, that we should really present or have it to represent, well, okay, let me say it this way. Si creo que se debe hacer algo para representar hombres y mujeres a la vez, sí creo eso, right? Sí creo. Pero no creo que incorporando una clase neutro es la solución, right? So I don't think that the neutral class in Spanish is really going to be the solution. Why? Well, it's not, no solamente porque soy cristiano, right? Because there's other problems. And I think that these things also reflect some detriment to our current society. As a Christian, I believe that. But my opinions also align with las creencias de la Biblia acerca del género, right? So it also aligns with that. At the same time, I think that the biological development, the natural and biological developments, right? Fuera de cierto caso, obviously there's some exceptions. It's odd and rare, and we should treat them with respect and dignity and encourage and help and support, right? But in general, there is a natural and biological development between humans, right? It's always been like that. The only time it's changed is when we got ourselves really meddled into it, apart from genetic differences or mutations, right? But these, reflect the exception, not the rule, right? And even biology affirms the essence of gender between men and women, right? And so I think that having a neutral class isn't necessarily the solution. And we need to find another way to be inclusive, to be respectful, to be, to not treat anybody, regardless of if it's race, if it's gender, to treat them as less. No. But it does get muddy sometimes. We should definitely have grace. We should definitely try to understand, to listen first, to try to be there for people regardless, right? So if someone's life or someone is in life is at risk or someone is in need, you support them regardless of what their view is or whether they use they or algunes or whatever. You at the end of the day, that their life is important, right? I mean, like I believe they're image bearers of God. Eso es importante. Si están hechos a la imagen de Dios, right? So we care for them regardless, right? But at least for this, I don't think that creating a neutral or a neuter a class, right, is going to be a solution because it could create a whole host of other problems. In my opinion, it's going to make people want to be less men, less women. And in reality, if we don't have men and women, we're not going to have children. We're not going to have families, and nucleuses of our society are going to deteriorate, and we're going to be in a lot of trouble. We're going to be individuals. everybody for themselves, individuals. We're going to have a host of genders, and it's all for ourselves. There was one article I read that it was like, there's as many genders as there are people. And once we start thinking in individual terms and everybody's just an individual, societies fall apart and we don't continue on. This generation would be the last. So I think that, of course, that sounds very pessimistic, but it could lead to some of those things. And so I think we need to have a conversation about how we be more inclusive and be more promoting, what it has to do with equality. But maybe that's not the direction, in my opinion, as a linguist. Now, all that to say, todo eso quiere decir que creo que esta sección, right? So this section, all that to say is that this section of the Civil Code, in my opinion, is very moderate, is very balanced sobre el género, right? In relation to gender. And because it distinguishes the masculine and the feminine, but at the same time, it says that when I'm referring to the masculine, I'm also referring to the feminine, where it is warranted, right? When it is by nature not contradictory, right? So of course a man cannot have children or be pregnant, no puede estar embarazado, right? So in some of those cases, then it's obviously not referring to men. And in some cases, it shows that women are actually more included or more involved than the men, right? And it is a balanced approach. They take a balanced approach in that civil code. Let me read it again. It says, right, las palabras usadas, right, 3 puntos, las usadas en masculino incluyen el femenino, right? So the words used in masculine also include the feminine, a menos que por la naturaleza de la disposición se limiten manifestamente a uno solo, right? Unless by nature it only refers to one, right? One gender. And I think that that's very balanced, very moderate. Y es fácil, it's easy to understand, fácil de entender, y la cual aplica al Código Civil en su plenitud, right? It completely, in that one phrase, it completely addresses the whole thing, the whole civil code, and how the citizens, como los ciudadanos, they're going to manifest in those words, in the law and how it applies in the code, right? So that's all I really have to say about that. Hope you found it interesting. Do your own investigation, like I said before. Dig, figure it out. Let's have a conversation about it, right? That's what it's about. And if you enjoy the podcast, follow the channel, share with your friends. For now, KRIS'S COURT is adjourned. Nos veremos para la próxima. The music in today's episode was by Ghost Beats and Benjamin Diesel. Hope you enjoyed.